We talked about guest through and guest access. So how do you make information available to these guests, and how do you audit or recertify?
Yeah. So the first thing to know about guests is that guest is a feature not just of Teams, but guest is really it's a feature of Office 365. So if you start at your admin portal for Office 365, you're going to see a Teams box here, and it's going to tell you whether or not guest access is on. So that first button, this is one of the ones that takes the longest. It gives you a warning that when you click it to turn on guest access in Teams, that it could take a couple of hours for those capabilities to turn on. The rest of them are pretty fast. Most of them are within a few minutes, and a few of them could take up to an hour, but this is the one that you need to plan ahead for. You also want to plan ahead for it from a security point of view and a compliance point of view and a support and operations point of view, because once you turn that on, your users are going to have a lot of ability to start inviting people in. And when you invite them in, you could unintentionally invite them into a SharePoint site that has sensitive information. So do plan before you turn that box on. If you've already turned that box on, that's probably a good time to get a pretty serious audit of your Teams, Exchange, and SharePoint settings, as well as your Azure conditional access settings, so that you know what access is actually allowed to those guests. The next set of settings comes down here in the organization-wide settings in Teams. So in my tenant here, I've locked Teams down from a federation point of view, and I've said anybody that I am going to trust for federation by Teams. That means they can contact my users by chat, or they can get accounts that allow them to temporarily have access to a SharePoint site. I want them all to be on this white list. By default, this list is not populated, and this button is on. So that means that external users can communicate with your organization. So one of the first things to do is to consider whether or not you need to lock that down, which chances are you need to, and then how are you going to manage that list of the organizations that you've federated with. The next organization-wide setting is guest access, and this is where we can say globally across our entire tenant, what are the things that guests are able to be given permission to do. So it doesn't necessarily say they have the permission, it only says that we've got rules that would allow guests to do these things. So for example, do we allow guest access at all? If I hit that button and turn that off, guests are very quickly not going to be able to access my Teams across any team, regardless of what the individual meeting or channel settings are. Whether or not calling is available, meetings and video, whether or not messaging is available. This is one I would normally say turn off those Giphies. At least for guest users, it's probably not all that valuable. Memes and stickers, again, unless you have a really important need on those, it's probably best to turn those off. The immersive reader is pretty helpful, so I think I've got a pretty good start for the organization. Again, you want to make sure that these align with your individual compliance requirements, audit policies, regulatory compliance requirements, because depending on your shape as an organization, some of this information, once you start allowing it, becomes information that you have to audit, and so you want to be careful about that. Tie it back to your compliance and retention settings in SharePoint and Exchange and in OneDrive, so that you've got the right kind of protections in place. So the other part that Bob was asking about is in the Azure portal itself. So in my Azure portal, I can go into Azure Active Directory, which for some reason is not at the top of my screen, and I can manage what are called external identities. So external identities are different sign-in users that are not part of your home domain. So if your home domain is edgile.com, This is going to be everybody that's outside of Edgile.com. And we can do permissions that allow us to manage those users and allow us to bring in guests, send them invites so they can start collaborating with your organization, keep track of email addresses. And again, the reason why it's so important to start moving toward guests is that, quite frankly, you don't know whether that person is still with that organization. So if you've got a vendor relationship and you've got a number of contractors that are on site working on your systems, how long is it before you know that they've left that vendor and you need to turn them off? By getting to Modern Auth and by getting to these kind of guest invites, we allow our vendors and partners and other organizations we work with to have more control over what users can be associated with their organization, but hopefully they do a pretty good job of identity management so that you can tell when they've been turned off. And I can, as Bob said, I can get in there and I can audit those and I can find out who's been using externally, and I can even get reports on guest access up here in my Teams dashboard, and find out who's been using what and what we need to turn on or turn off.